A judge, convinced by the words of two white officers, seemed ready to rule against a black woman accused of resisting arrest. The courtroom held its breath as she stood firm, her voice unwavering, revealing a truth that shattered expectations. She was a United States prosecutor. Gasps echoed through the chamber as the power dynamics shifted instantly, leaving the officers scrambling to justify their actions. Justice was no longer in their control, and the judge's once certain stance began to crumble. Watch the full story unfold. Subscribe and like this video to witness a battle that changed everything. The morning air was thick with tension as the courthouse doors swung open. The case was simple on paper: a young black woman accused of resisting arrest and obstructing justice. But from the moment she entered the room, every eye was on her, judging, dissecting, anticipating. Judge Alan Whitaker, known for his deference to law enforcement, sat high above the courtroom, his fingers drumming idly on the bench as he reviewed the preliminary charges. Across the room, two white officers, Sergeant Ryan Keller and Officer Thomas Briggs, sat with smug expressions, confident in the system that had always protected them. The defendant, Elise Harrington, walked with a measured grace that seemed to unsettle those expecting fear. She said nothing as she took her place at the defense table, her attorney, Malcolm Graves, exchanging a quick glance with her. The prosecution wasted no time, launching into a meticulous recounting of events designed to paint Elise as belligerent and uncooperative. Keller recounted how she had refused a lawful order, had resisted detainment, had displayed clear hostility toward the officers who had simply been doing their jobs. Briggs corroborated every word, nodding along, punctuating the story with subtle smirks. Judge Whitaker listened, his expression unreadable, but his lean toward the officers was obvious. When the prosecution rested, Malcolm Graves stood, his presence commanding but calm. He requested a moment before launching the defense, and with a nod from Elise, he approached the bench. The judge gave an impatient sigh but allowed it. What followed was a silent exchange that sent ripples through the courtroom. Graves slid a folder across the bench, his voice hushed but firm. Whitaker flipped it open, his gaze narrowing as he took in the contents. His fingers stiffened around the pages. His jaw clenched ever so slightly. The weight of the revelation hit him, the reality settling over the courtroom like a shifting tide. Elise Harrington wasn't just another defendant. She was a United States attorney. The judge's lips parted slightly before pressing into a thin line. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their confidence suddenly less assured. Malcolm stepped back, his expression unreadable as he returned to Elise's side. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, his tone more careful now as he resumed. The defense may proceed. A murmur spread through the spectators. The sudden shift in energy was palpable. Elise met Keller's gaze, holding it just long enough to see the flicker of doubt creep into his posture. She had seen this play before, how the certainty of unchecked authority wavered in the face of exposure. She had chosen silence up until this moment, watching, absorbing, calculating. Now, it was time to speak. Her voice rang clear through the courtroom, carrying the weight of unshaken resolve. She detailed the night in question, countering every exaggerated claim with precision, revealing inconsistencies, dismantling the officer's narrative one careful statement at a time. The tension climbed, thick as smoke. Keller and Briggs exchanged glances, suddenly aware that the game had changed. They had walked in expecting an easy win, only to find themselves trapped in a battle they hadn't prepared for. Then, the moment that shattered the room. The court doors swung open once more, and a messenger, pale and breathless, stepped inside. He carried a single envelope, the insignia unmistakable. The judge took it without a word, eyes scanning its contents. His complexion paled. He set the paper down slowly, carefully, before meeting Elise's gaze. "The court will take a brief recess," he announced, his voice slightly unsteady. As the gavel struck, the once smug officers sat frozen, their carefully crafted case unraveling. Elise exhaled, unshaken, knowing that the truth had finally started to turn the tide in her favor. The tension inside the courtroom thickened as the recess ended and Judge Whitaker resumed his place on the bench. His expression, though carefully composed, carried a subtle strain. He shifted slightly in his seat, a rare sign of discomfort from a man so used to controlling the tempo of proceedings. The revelation of Elise Harrington's identity had rattled him, but he quickly masked it beneath a veneer of procedural authority. As the court reconvened, the air felt different. The spectators murmured, whispering theories about what the recess meant. The officers, Keller and Briggs, had lost their earlier smugness, their confident facade faltering in the face of uncertainty. Yet, despite the shift, a lingering arrogance remained, a belief that the system would still work in their favor. Elise, seated at the defense table, remained composed. Years in the legal field had prepared her for adversarial encounters, but the undercurrent of bias in the room was undeniable. Judge Whittaker's eyes barely met hers as he addressed the court, his tone clipped and impersonal. "Proceed with the defense's argument," he ordered, but his voice lacked the authority it once carried. Malcolm Graves rose, unshaken by the judge's curt demeanor. "Your Honor, we request the immediate disclosure of all body camera footage from Officers Keller and Briggs. Given the discrepancies in their testimonies, it is imperative that we have access to all relevant evidence." The judge barely concealed his irritation. "The prosecution has assured this court that all necessary evidence has been submitted." Graves did not back down. "Then they should have no problem ensuring full transparency. If the footage supports their claims, let it be reviewed." A ripple of agreement spread through the gallery. The request was reasonable, but the pushback from the bench and prosecution hinted at a deeper reluctance. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Marion Langford, rose with a carefully measured response. "Your Honor, while the footage does exist, portions of it may be considered irrelevant or privileged due to ongoing internal investigations." Elise noted the strategic wording and attempt to stall, to obfuscate. She leaned in, speaking softly but firmly. "This is standard delay tactics. If there was anything exculpatory, it would have already been presented." Judge Whittaker exhaled through his nose, fingers tapping the bench. The room waited, tension rising with every passing second. "Fine," he relented, his tone betraying frustration. "The footage will be reviewed in chambers before determining its admissibility." It was a partial victory, but Elise knew better than to celebrate yet. The judge's reluctance signaled resistance, an effort to keep control over a case that had already spiraled beyond his expectations. As the proceedings continued, the courtroom's hostility became more overt. Langford frequently interrupted Graves' questioning, objecting with thinly veiled condescension. Each time Elise spoke, the judge's expression grew more rigid, his responses tinged with impatience. The message was clear: her presence unsettled the courtroom's expected dynamics, and some resented it. But Elise remained steady. She had spent years dismantling walls built to keep people like her out. If they thought their resistance would shake her, they had underestimated the force of her resolve. The battle was far from over, but the foundation beneath her opponents had already begun to crack. They just didn't realize it yet. As Graves continued the defense's argument, he turned to a key witness, an independent forensic analyst who had reviewed the officers' reports. The analyst methodically dismantled the inconsistencies in Keller and Briggs' statements, pointing out that timestamps did not align, and that their sworn testimonies contained contradictions. The judge shifted in his seat, the growing weight of the evidence forcing his expression into something resembling reluctant contemplation. The prosecutor objected frequently, often with vague references to procedural concerns, but Graves countered each one smoothly, pressing forward with relentless precision. The tension in the room escalated further when a new piece of evidence was introduced: a grainy security camera video from a nearby storefront, showing the moment Elise was stopped. The video contradicted the officer's claims, revealing a calm and composed Elise being confronted with unwarranted aggression. Keller and Briggs exchanged wary glances, their earlier confidence draining. Elise caught the flicker of realization in their eyes. This wasn't going as they had expected. Judge Whittaker hesitated for a moment too long before allowing the video to be played, as if realizing that suppressing it now would raise too many questions. The gallery leaned in, eyes fixed on the screen as the truth unraveled before them. As the court proceedings dragged on, another unexpected twist emerged. An anonymous source had leaked an internal memo revealing that Keller and Briggs had been subjects of prior complaints that had been quietly dismissed. Graves presented the document with measured control, his tone never rising, but his words slicing through the prosecution's case with precision. Judge Whittaker's mask of impartiality cracked slightly. A new tension gripped the room, an undercurrent of something shifting in real time. Elise met the judge's gaze for the first time since revealing her credentials. She saw it there, the weight of realization, the understanding that he was being watched, that this case was no longer just another routine matter to be rubber-stamped in favor of the prosecution. As the day drew to a close, Judge Whittaker called for another recess. The air inside the courtroom was charged, uncertainty now gripping those who had once felt invincible. Elise knew that the walls around them were beginning to crumble, but she also knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The courtroom had reached a boiling point, the tension thick enough to suffocate. The prosecution had thrown every accusation they could muster at Elise Harrington, determined to paint her as an uncooperative and hostile defendant. Judge Whittaker, ever the pillar of unwavering authority, had thus far leaned in favor of the officers, allowing their testimonies to overshadow the glaring inconsistencies in their statements. The weight of the court's bias pressed down on Elise like an unshakable force, but she remained composed, knowing the moment of reckoning was near. As the prosecution's argument reached its peak, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open abruptly. A young court clerk, pale and visibly shaken, hurried toward the judge's bench, a sealed envelope clutched tightly in his hand. The murmurs in the gallery intensified as eyes darted between the judge and the unknown message. Judge Whittaker, visibly irked by the interruption, took the envelope and tore it open. His expression, hardened by years of presiding over difficult cases, faltered. His eyes scanned the letter, and for the first time since the trial began, his hands trembled ever so slightly. The silence in the room deepened as the weight of the letter settled over him. His gaze flickered toward Elise, uncertainty clouding his once unwavering demeanor. Elise did not need to see the letter to know what it contained. She could sense the shift in the room. The defense table remained still, Malcolm Graves watching the judge carefully, waiting for the scales to tip. The prosecution's confidence wavered as Marion Langford shifted uncomfortably, trying to decipher what had just transpired. The judge cleared his throat, forcing an air of control. "We will be taking an immediate recess. The court will reconvene shortly." But it was too late. The balance of power had already shifted. As the judge rose, so did the tension in the room. The prosecution huddled together, their hushed voices laced with concern. Keller and Briggs, the two officers who had once sat with unshaken confidence, now looked to one another with uncertainty. The moment they had feared had arrived. Elise stood slowly, allowing the courtroom silence to consume the weight of what had just occurred. She knew what the letter contained, a direct communication from the White House. The highest office in the land had been made aware of the case, and the implications were too great to be ignored. There would be no quiet dismissal, no backroom deals to sweep this under the rug. In the judge's chambers, Whittaker sat with his head in his hands, the letter still open before him. The presence of the White House in this case meant scrutiny beyond his control. His decisions would be dissected, his conduct examined under a microscope. Any attempt to dismiss Elise's claims could be seen as obstruction, and his judicial career, his entire legacy hung in the balance. Meanwhile, in the prosecution's makeshift office down the hall, Langford was frantically making calls, demanding answers. Who had escalated this case to Washington? What did Elise know, and why had the government intervened? The certainty that had anchored her strategy was crumbling. Elise, however, was prepared. She had played the long game, had waited for this exact moment. When the recess ended, she returned to the courtroom with quiet confidence. Judge Whittaker's expression was unreadable, but the weight of authority that once loomed over her had shifted. The balance had begun to tip, and for the first time since this trial began, justice felt within reach. She turned to face the gallery, where whispers still rippled through the spectators. She met Keller's eyes, and for the first time, he looked away. The realization dawned upon them: all this was no longer a simple case. This was something much bigger, and Elise Harrington was no ordinary defendant. The moment had come. The truth was no longer something that could be ignored, and Elise was ready to ensure that everyone in that room would witness it unfold. The courtroom doors opened again, but this time it was not a nervous court clerk, it was a sharply dressed man carrying a Department of Justice identification badge. He strode confidently to the judge's bench and handed over another document. This time, as the judge read, his face paled further. The government was now formally observing the case, ensuring that every move was recorded and scrutinized. Keller and Briggs exchanged alarmed glances. Langford bit her lip, rapidly adjusting her argument in her mind. The spectators murmured louder. The courtroom had become a spectacle, and the weight of the federal government's gaze now bore down on them all. Judge Whittaker's voice wavered slightly as he addressed the court. Given new developments, this case will continue with an official review from federal oversight. Elise allowed herself the faintest of smiles. The tables had turned. The once unshakable certainty of her opponents was now riddled with doubt. And this was only the beginning. The courtroom tension reached its breaking point as Elise Harrington sat across from the officers who had once believed they held all the power. The weight of the White House's involvement had sent shockwaves through the judicial process, shaking the foundation of what had once seemed like an unshakable prosecution against her. Judge Whittaker, previously unwavering in his bias, now tread carefully, the knowledge that every decision was being scrutinized looming over him. Keller and Briggs, once confident in their fabricated testimony, could no longer meet the eyes of those in the room. Their statements, once carefully constructed to frame Elise as a combative and uncooperative suspect, began to unravel under the scrutiny of the newly assigned Federal Oversight Committee. The prosecution's once ironclad narrative now had visible cracks, each one deepening as Elise's defense methodically dismantled the case against her. The first blow came with the forensic analysis of the body camera footage. What had once been tampered with to exclude key moments was now presented in its full, unaltered form. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the full exchange between Elise and the officers played out. The aggression, the unwarranted escalation, the sneering disdain in Keller's voice as he belittled her, it was all there, undeniable and damning. The jury, previously uncertain, shifted visibly in their seats. The spectators gasped, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Langford, the prosecutor, attempted to regain control, arguing that the footage did not change the fundamental aspects of the case. But her voice lacked conviction. Elise's defense team pounced, presenting the documented history of both officers' allegations of misconduct, racial profiling, and previous instances of excessive force. The evidence, once buried under bureaucratic red tape, now laid bare before the court. The next devastating turn came when Keller and Briggs were called to the stand. Their previous confidence now replaced by visible discomfort, they faltered under questioning. Elise's lead attorney, Malcolm Graves, wasted no time exposing the discrepancies in their statements. Keller stuttered through his testimony, unable to reconcile the timeline he had once presented with the irrefutable evidence now stacked against him. Briggs, though attempting to maintain composure, cracked under cross-examination, inadvertently admitting that aspects of their report had been embellished. Judge Whittaker, who had been resisting the shift in power dynamics, could no longer ignore the trajectory of the trial. He cleared his throat, a sign of reluctant acknowledgement that the case against Elise had crumbled. With federal agents watching from the gallery, the pressure was insurmountable. A final blow landed with the testimony of an unexpected witness. One of Keller's former colleagues, a retired officer, took the stand, revealing that Keller had openly bragged about teaching people like her a lesson. His words echoed through the courtroom, solidifying what everyone had already begun to suspect: this was not about justice. It never had been. As the final moments of the trial approached, Elise remained calm, her gaze unwavering. The verdict was inevitable. The jury, no longer under the influence of manipulated evidence, deliberated for only an hour before returning with their decision. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. The once looming threat of wrongful conviction had evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of vindication. Elise stood, finally free, as Keller and Briggs were taken into custody for falsifying reports and obstructing justice. Langford, realizing her once promising case had collapsed, stood in stunned silence as Judge Whittaker announced that the entire case would be referred to the Department of Justice for further review. Elise walked out of the courtroom with her head high. Justice had prevailed, but this was only the beginning. The case had exposed a deeper rot within the system, and now, with momentum on her side, she was determined to ensure no one else would suffer the same fate. Keller and Briggs, once the untouchable enforcers of their own brand of law, now faced the full weight of the justice system they had so often manipulated. Their downfall was swift, public, and absolute. Their legacy, once built on intimidation and control, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale of what happens when corruption meets its reckoning. The media frenzy following the verdict was relentless. Elise found herself at the center of national headlines, her face plastered across television screens and newspapers. Civil rights groups hailed her as a beacon of resistance against systemic abuse, while law enforcement agencies across the country felt the pressure to re-evaluate their policies. News pundits debated the larger implications of the trial, questioning how many more cases like Elise's have been buried under falsified reports and judicial bias. Outside the courthouse, a massive crowd had gathered, waiting for Elise to step forward. Reporters bombarded her with questions, cameras flashing incessantly. She took a deep breath, then stepped up to the podium. Her voice, steady and resolute, carried over the crowd. "This trial was never just about me," she said. "It was about a system that has failed too many people for too long. Today's verdict is a step toward accountability, but it is only one step. There is still so much work to be done. No one should have to fight this hard just to prove their innocence." The applause was deafening. People chanted her name, calling for change, demanding justice for others who had suffered similar fates. Elise knew this fight was far from over, but in that moment, she allowed herself to feel the victory. The battle had been hard-fought, and justice, though long overdue, had finally been served. In the days that followed, Keller and Briggs were officially charged with perjury and obstruction of justice. Investigations were launched into their previous cases, with many of their past convictions being overturned due to tainted evidence. Judge Whittaker, facing immense public and political pressure, announced an early retirement, citing personal reasons. Langford's career took a significant hit, her credibility as a prosecutor now irreparably damaged. Elise, however, did not retreat into obscurity. She took this momentum and channeled it into advocacy, working alongside organizations dedicated to criminal justice reform. She met with lawmakers, testified before congressional panels, and helped draft policies aimed at holding law enforcement accountable. Her journey had transformed from one of personal survival to one of systemic change. The trial had started as an attempt to destroy her. Instead, it had ignited a movement, one that would continue to reshape the very foundation of the justice system for years to come. And as Elise stood before a crowd of supporters, knowing that the echoes of her victory would reverberate far beyond that courtroom, she understood that this was just the beginning of something far greater than herself. Elise Harrington's victory in the courtroom was not the end of the battle, it was the beginning of a seismic shift in the justice system. The aftermath of the trial sent shockwaves through the legal and law enforcement communities, forcing institutions to confront their long-standing biases and accountability gaps. The public, emboldened by Elise's triumph, demanded systematic change, and Elise, now a symbol of resistance and justice, found herself thrust into a new role, one she never anticipated but embraced wholeheartedly. As the news of the case spread, civil rights organizations mobilized, using Elise's case as the catalyst for national discussions on police misconduct, judicial impartiality, and prosecutorial ethics. Elise was invited to speak at universities, legal summits, and policy forums. She was no longer just a defense attorney fighting for herself, she had become a voice for countless others who had been silenced by a broken system. Legislators took notice. A coalition of progressive policymakers introduced a bill aimed at reforming police accountability measures, ensuring that officers like Keller and Briggs could no longer manipulate the system to protect themselves. Elise worked alongside legal experts to draft provisions that would require greater oversight in internal investigations and harsher penalties for officers caught falsifying reports. The bill initially met with resistance from law enforcement unions, gained traction after public protests and media coverage made it impossible to ignore. The legal repercussions for Keller and Briggs intensified. Their department's internal affairs unit, under pressure from the Department of Justice, reopened past cases they had handled. Several convictions tied to their testimonies were overturned, revealing a pattern of fabricated evidence and coerced confessions. Elise, alongside a team of civil rights attorneys, helped represent individuals who had been wrongfully convicted due to their misconduct. The ripple effect of the case grew wider, as more officers with histories of abuse were placed under scrutiny. Judge Whittaker's downfall was equally swift. The revelations of his biased rulings and favoritism toward law enforcement became a point of contention in legal circles. Under public pressure, he resigned from the bench, citing personal reasons. His departure symbolized the crumbling of an outdated judicial framework that had long enabled the injustices Elise fought against. In his place, a new judge was appointed, one with a reputation for fairness and integrity, marking a significant victory in the broader fight for judicial reform. Elise's transformation from a wrongfully accused attorney to a national advocate did not come without sacrifice. The emotional toll of the trial, the media scrutiny, and the constant fight against entrenched power structures weighed heavily on her. But she refused to back down. She partnered with civil rights groups to launch a foundation aimed at providing legal support for marginalized individuals facing wrongful prosecution. She established a mentorship program for young law students from underrepresented communities, ensuring that the next generation of attorneys would continue the fight for justice. The legal community reacted in twofold. Some hailed Elise as a revolutionary force, while others, particularly those deeply embedded in the old guard, saw her as a disruptive influence. Yet, despite the criticism, her influence continued to grow. Her presence in legal panels, court hearings, and policy meetings ensured that the conversation on justice reform remained at the forefront. National media continued to follow her journey. She was featured in investigative reports exposing systemic failures in the justice system, and her story was adapted into a best-selling book detailing her legal battle and the broader implications of her case. Filmmakers reached out with interest in bringing her story to a wider audience, further amplifying her impact. Though the road ahead was long, Elise remained unwavering in her mission. She knew that real change did not happen overnight, but through persistent efforts, difficult conversations, and relentless advocacy. Every overturned conviction, every legislative reform, and every young lawyer she mentored became a testament to the power of resilience. Years after the trial, Elise stood on the steps of the Supreme Court, addressing a crowd of thousands. She spoke not just as an attorney, but as a symbol of what could be achieved when individuals refused to be silenced by corruption and fear. She called for continued vigilance, for holding those in power accountable, and for building a justice system that truly served all people, not just a privileged few. As she stepped away from the podium, she knew that her fight was far from over. But looking into the faces of those who had been inspired by her struggle, she also knew that she was no longer fighting alone. Justice had found a champion in Elise Harrington, and her impact would resonate for generations to come. The story of Elise Harrington was not just a courtroom battle, but a reflection of a deeply entrenched issue within the American legal system. Her journey, from being falsely accused and humiliated to becoming a national symbol of justice, underscored the pervasive racial disparities in law enforcement and the judiciary. Her case was not an anomaly, it was a testament to the experiences of countless individuals who had been silenced by systemic discrimination. The trial and its aftermath revealed the uncomfortable truth about racial profiling and judicial bias. It exposed the reality that the legal system, designed to uphold justice, had often served as a tool of oppression for marginalized communities. Elise's experience resonated with many, particularly those who had long suffered under the weight of prejudice and inequity. It was a stark reminder that the scales of justice were not always balanced, and that real reform required not only legal victories but also societal awakening. At the heart of Elise's triumph was the undeniable power of legal knowledge. She had wielded her expertise as both a shield and a weapon, countering lies with facts, injustice with undeniable evidence. Her ability to navigate the complexities of the law had turned the tables on those who sought to silence her. Her case became a rallying cry for aspiring lawyers, activists, and citizens determined to understand their rights and challenge those who sought to violate them. Justice, in the end, had prevailed. The corrupt officers who had conspired against her faced severe consequences, their past transgressions unearthed and scrutinized under a national spotlight. The biased judge who had initially dismissed her had been forced into resignation, a cautionary tale for those who let prejudice dictate their rulings. The victory in Elise's case set a precedent that could not be ignored, shifting the conversation around police accountability and judicial fairness. Beyond the courtroom, Elise's influence grew. She became an advocate for policy reform, working with legislators to implement safeguards against the kind of misconduct she had endured. She spearheaded initiatives aimed at diversifying the judicial system, ensuring that future generations of legal professionals reflected the diversity of the communities they served. Her efforts bore fruit as institutions began to introduce measures to prevent racial profiling and increase transparency in legal proceedings. Elise's story was one of resilience, but it was also a story of collective strength. The outpouring of support from activists, fellow attorneys, and ordinary citizens had been instrumental in her fight. It was proof that individual courage, when backed by a community, could shake even the most rigid institutions. Her victory was not just her own, it belonged to everyone who had ever faced discrimination, everyone who had ever been told their voice did not matter. As her story reached new audiences, Elise found herself at the center of a broader movement. Universities invited her to speak on criminal justice reform. Civil rights organizations sought her expertise in legislative battles. Media outlets chronicled her journey, framing her as a beacon of hope in an era fraught with division and distrust. Her influence extended beyond policy. She had become a symbol of what was possible when one refused to be silenced. Through her perseverance, Elise had carved out a legacy that would endure for generations. Her story served as both a warning and an inspiration. It warned of the dangers of unchecked power, of the ease with which bias could corrupt even the most sacred institutions. But more importantly, it inspired a testament to the power of standing firm in the face of adversity, to the belief that justice, though often delayed, could never truly be denied. In the years that followed, Elise continued her work, never losing sight of the bigger picture. She mentored young lawyers, ensuring that they, too, understood the importance of wielding the law in the service of truth. She pushed for national legal reforms, leveraging her case as a catalyst for systemic change. And though the scars of her ordeal remained, they became symbols of strength rather than defeat. Elise Harrington's battle had been a long and arduous one, but in the end, she had proven that knowledge, courage, and unity were formidable forces against injustice. Her fight had started as a personal one, but it had evolved into something far greater. She had become more than a survivor, she had become a beacon for those still fighting, a reminder that the pursuit of justice was a battle worth waging. And so, as Elise looked ahead, she knew that her journey was far from over. There were still laws to change, voices to uplift, and institutions to hold accountable. But she also knew one immutable truth: justice, no matter how long it took, would always find its way to the light.